let's talk about tables. Tables are another HTML element we can add into our website. What is a table? Here, I found this off of Google a mere 90 seconds ago. We've all seen them before. It's table data, Excel spreadsheets. It's a nice way to organize and present data and stuff like that. So you'll see tables quite a bit on websites. Sometimes they look like tables pretty explicitly, and sometimes they're disguised pretty well, but they use a table HTML structure. How do we use a table? Well, and I recommend following along and doing this yourself, because making tables is slightly confusing, or at least way more confusing than the other elements. The other elements are easy. This one's a little tricky. We waited till we talked about the CSS because we're going to need to use a lot of stylings to make our tables look semi-decent at best. I've got my index and my style. You want to create a table? Well, who would have thought? You use the table tag. Opening and closing table tag. Fire up your website. Nothing there. I don't see a table. Well, that's because tables need data. So, when you are making a table, the way I always thought of it, best to learn, is you go row by row. So, for example, let me get a nice bright color here. Here is the first table row. So rows go horizontally. This is called a column. I find it's easier to make tables going row by row. So we could call this row 1. We could call this row 2. We could call this row 3. And you get the point. 4, 5, 6, 7. So this table has 7 rows of data. And when you're coding tables in HTML, it is a good idea to go and code each row before moving on to the next one. So let's do that. So if I want to start on the first row, that is this row right here, I say, okay, I've created a table and now I want to create a table row. So I want to add a row to my table. So I use the opening and closing TR tags. And boom, I've just created my first row in my table. And if I go on my website, there's still nothing there because, well, I haven't added anything to my table, nor have I added anything to the rows. So let's look at the table I'm trying to recreate. The very first thing in this first row is first name. Now, tables are often, they kind of have like a title as their first row. See how this row is clearly aesthetically different than these bottom 6 rows. That's because this is called a table header, and it's good convention to include table headers when you make a table. So for this first row, I'm going to insert an element into my table, and it is my first row, so I'm going to use a table header, TH. This is what I'm coding right now. So my first cell in my first row says first name. So I'm going to put first name. And now my website. Okay, there we go. There's my first cell. All right, still in the first row. Let's do this cell where it says last name. So within the same row, within the same TR table row, I'm going to add another cell. And this is going to be another header because it's in my first row. So I'll say last name. Save it. And now that's what my table looks like. And finally, the last cell in this first row is date of birth. So within the same row, within the same TR, I'm going to add one more cell, and it's going to be a header, and I already forget what it said. It's end of the day, date of birth. Date of birth. And now I have my 3 cells in my table. 1, 2, 3. All right, so the first row is done with. let's move on to the second row. So back in my HTML, I'm done with my first table row, my first TR. So outside of it, but still inside my table element, I'm going to add another row. And I'm done with the header, right? Because the headers are typically just the first cells in your first row. So now I'm just including, we call table data. So this is just normal data. So in this second row, the first cell, I'm going to throw this under my table, John. So I'm not going to use a table header. I'm just going to use a TD, which stands for table data. And I'm going to say this cell just says John. Control S to save. And you can see that John gets slid right under that first column in the second row. Still in row 2, but moving to the next cell, I've got Doe for the last name. So I'm going to add another cell, and I'm going to say Doe. Save it. And there is Doe. And lastly, let's do one more, a date of birth. I'm not going to remember those numbers, so I'll just throw in whatever I want. Another cell. That was a mighty old date of birth. It was something like this. I can't remember. And now my cell, my second row is complete. Okay, I think you get the idea. Table doesn't look too good though, compared to this one. This one's very nice, or at least nicer than ours. So let's look at some common stylings that we can use with tables. And there's a lot of them. That's why we introduced the CSS before we talked about this. I don't know. I've got an extra TR. I'm not too sure what happened there. TR. There we go. For example, right off the bat, this table has a border. You can see each of these cells are kind of divided up by some lines. So we can add some lines to our table. Why not? So to do this, I'm going to go into my style, and I'm going to stylize my table element, and I'm going to give my table a border. And what kind of border am I going to give my table? Well, I'm going to give it a 1 pixel wide solid black border, which is pretty standard. So now my table should have this solid black border. Let's take a look. There we go. I see a border. So you can see the border is basically outlining this table element. But this table I'm looking at has borders everywhere. It has a border on the outside, much like ours does, but it also has borders in between each cell. So easy fix. Not only do I want to stylize my table, I want to style and give a border to all of the table data inside my table, as well as the table headers that we started with on that first row. And now you can see that my table has borders everywhere. Each cell is clearly defined and outlined. But there's something funny going on. There's like this double border going on, which is cool, I guess, if you want it like that. But if you don't want this border, there's basically a 1 pixel wide padding in between each of these lines. So if you want to get rid of that, you can hit it with the old, one of these numbers. You can hit it with the old border collapse. And what that will do is it will get rid of that extra padding, and the borders will just be nice and clean. Okay. Couple other things. We're looking a little cramped for space. There's not much room to breathe in my table. So I could make my table wider. I could make all of those elements wider. I don't know how much width I need, but we could try a width of 300 pixels. And it gave me some breathing room. Let's try 500. There we go. And now what you're noticing with that added width is by default, my table header, my very first row of my table, by default, that text is not only bolded, but it is also centered horizontally. Notice how it's in the center of these cells, whereas the table data is not bolded and it's aligned to the left. So it's being hit with a text align to the left. So it does that for a reason. Kind of makes the data a little bit easier to look at. And I know our table doesn't really have any room vertically, but we could give our table some more space in the vertical direction. We could hit it with the old height. So I don't know, we could make our table a little bit taller. That's maybe too tall. Or, big brain time, I like the height of my headers, but maybe I don't like the height of this second row, this table data. So what I could do is I could say, you know what? I just want my table headers to be nice and tall. So I've signified that I want to stylize the TH, the table headers, and now my table header is nice and tall, and my table data stays compressed. Speaking of which, the table header, sometimes just like the one we were looking at, see how the background is a different color? So I could do that here. I could go background color, dark blue, if we really want to replicate what's going on here. And now the table header has a dark blue background. And I could color the data inside my table headers. So in other words, the text. And there we go. And sorry, I really just not a fan of that blue. It's a little bold. Not that it matters for the video. Sure, something a little softer. Ah, much better. And there we go. So that's tables for you. And it's very nice to be able to style them nicely with a CSS sheet. And if I wanted to add the third row, I could add in another row. And I could just make up some stuff. I could say Bob. I could say Bob. What's his last name? Give me a last name for Bob. Bob. I don't know. Bob Smalls. And Bob Smalls was born on 1987. February the 14th, or today's date, the 11th. And just like that, I've added in a third row to my table. Nice and formatted, and that's why we love tables. I don't have to worry about any spacing. It just sits where it needs to be. Okay, cool.